안녕하세요. 저는 한국경영학회와 sbs문화재단이 공동 주최하는 포럼의 사회를 맡은 경희대학교 교수 장혜정입니다. 코로나19 팬데믹을 겪으면서 세계는 미래를 예측할 수 없는 불확실성 속에 갇혀 있습니다. 새로운 대변혁의 물결이 다가오는 지금 한국경영학회와 sbs문화재단은 뉴노멀 시대에 우리가 공존하여 번영할 수 있는 새로운 방법을 제안하고자 이번 포럼을 개최하게 되었습니다. 오늘 프로그램은 총 3세션으로 구성되어 5시 30분까지 준비되어 있습니다. 온 오프라인으로 참여하시는 참석자 여러분들 모두 마지막 세션까지 함께 해 주시길 부탁드립니다. 그럼 본격적인 세션의 시작에 앞서 한국경영학회 박영렬 회장님의 인사 말씀이 있겠습니다. 회장님을 단상으로 모시겠습니다.
안녕하세요. 한국경영학회 회장을 맡고 있는 연세대학교 경영대학의 박영렬 교수입니다. sbs문화재단과 경영학회가 공동 주최하는 뉴노멀시대의 대변혁과 공존의 리더십 포럼에 참여해 주신 모든 분을 환영합니다. 코로나19 팬데믹을 겪으면서 세계는 미래를 예측할 수 없는 불확실성 속에 갇혀 있습니다. 뉴노멀 시대 대변혁의 물결이 우리에게 다가오고 있는 상황에서 우리 사회가 가지고 있는 기후변화, 경제적 양극화, 지속성장 등과 같은 문제를 현재의 방식으로 대응해서는 인류의 생존과 안전을 담보할 수 없습니다. sbs문화재단과 한국경영학회는 대변혁의 시대에 우리가 공존하여 번영할 수 있는 리더십을 이번 포럼을 통해서 모색하고자 합니다. 국가, 사회, 기업, 개인 등 국경을 넘어 함께 더 나은 세상을 만들기 위한 뉴노멀 시대 공존을 위한 지혜를 논의하고 새롭고 올바른 길을 제안하고자 합니다. We cordially invite all of you to the joint forum held by SBS Foundation and the Korean Academic Society of Business Administration, KASBA. We would like to express deep thanks to the presenters and participants in today's forum, especially moderator of the first session, Senior Editor Nora Amico from Harvard Business Review, and the three presenters, Senior Researcher Jace Mikkelien of University of Oslo, and Professor John Katos of American University of Sharjah, and Professor Young-Chang Kim of Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea. In the second session, we appreciate the participation of two famous scholars, Professor Mariana Mazzucato of University College London and Professor Duan Lee, Dean of College of Economics of Yonsei University. In the final session, three professors in Korea, Professor Jung-ha Kim of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Professor Byung-Chek Jin of KAIST, and Professor Ji-young An of Ewha Women's University, will be discussed on the leadership on the new normal, and we appreciate valuable participation in this forum. The post-COVID world will surely require an era in which dramatic changes will be new normal. Through this forum, SBS Foundation and CASPAR seek to take the lead in gathering ideas and opinions on how nations can coexist and prosper in a safer environment. We would like to discuss pathways to the new normal era to create a better world together across national, social, corporate, and individual boundaries and suggest new and light way. Once again, thanks for all the participants and staffs preparing for today's wonderful forum, and we appreciate your attention and support. Thank you.
회장님 말씀 감사합니다. 이제 한국경영학회와 Sbs문화재단의 공동포럼 뉴노멀시대의 대변혁과 공존의 리더십의 본 세션을 시작하겠습니다. Business in Conflict Zone and Times of Crisis라는 주제로 진행되는 첫 번째 세션은 하버드 비즈니스 리뷰의 시니어 에디터이신 로라 아미코 선생님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다. 많은 관심 부탁드립니다. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Amiko, who is joining us online from Boston. We all realize it's late over there, so we deeply appreciate you taking your valuable time to lead a session of our forum today. So, without any further ado, why don't we go ahead and begin your session?
All of you in the beautiful city of Seoul. I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing for the very first time Harvard Business Review's forthcoming series, A New Crisis Playbook for an Uncertain World. This is, as you probably realize and feel, particularly timely research. Who among us has not felt the discomfort of the past year and a half or even longer? But I come today with a surprise for you. This here is a hopeful presentation. It is even a joyful one. And that is because the findings our panelists will present are not just about how businesses can thrive in times of extreme stress, but how we can all thrive. Now, I realize this is not a small promise. And it is why when our panelists approached HBR with the idea for the series, I jumped at the opportunity to work with them. What could be more important than ensuring a pathway for all of us to emerge from crisis better, stronger, and richer than before? Our panelists, John Katsos, an associate professor at the American University of Sharjah, and Jason Miklian, a senior researcher at the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo, have conducted more than a decade of fieldwork and other research in the emerging business for peace academic field. Altogether, they have studied hundreds of cases of businesses thriving, scraping by, or crumbling through a broad range of political and social conflict. They call it the era of uncertainty. And I'll say that again because I think that this phrase is really important today, the era of uncertainty. That Professors Katsos and Miklian identify is marked by three factors: climate change, globalization, inequality. As Professors Katsos and Miklian aptly note, these three long-term trends make the occasional crisis worse. A more destructive hurricane, a more widespread financial meltdown, longer or more violent civil unrest. But together they cause chains of crises. Just as one, like COVID-19 ebbs, the next one, like political upheaval or rapid inflation, picks up. Sound familiar? But I told you this would be a hopeful presentation. And so I share the good news. There is a way through this. Professors Katsos and Miklian have found that companies that do three things can carry us through this uncertainty. They prepare socio-politically at the leadership level. They build the reality of crisis into their operating culture at the organizational level. And they make principled political choices at the community level. Not easy, but they do it. And companies that do these things not only survive, but they thrive through uncertain times. And their communities do too. To discuss their research, Professors Katsos and Miklian are joined by Professor Young-Chan Kim, a professor of business administration at the Yonsei University School of Business. He is currently president of the Korean Marketing Association and was previously president of the Korean Society of Consumer Studies. Professor Kim, we look forward to your thoughts and contributions on this important topic very much. Before we begin, though, I'd like to say a warm thank you to our hosts at CASPA and SBS. Their support, assistance, and encouragement has brought you this presentation today. And to read the new crisis playbook when it publishes on Thursday, please do visit hbr.org/crisis, where we have a full series ready for you. Now, we first go to Professor McLean. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, for that really wonderful introduction. John and I will do our best to try to live up to it. And I'm just going to reiterate as well, thank you so much to the SBS and CASPA teams for having us. We're really thrilled at this opportunity to have a chance to talk a little bit about our research and have a bit of a discussion with everyone there too. So let me just, without further ado, I can get our slides started. I think this should work. Right. And can you all see that? Greetings. Yes, as Laura mentioned, my name is Jason, and along with my colleague John, we are here to talk today about thriving in the area of uncertainty. It's a presentation that's been based upon our decade of research of companies, mostly in crisis and conflict zones, but not exclusive to that. And as Laura mentioned, I just want to reiterate these three macro trends that we are all going to have to deal with all over the world of climate change, globalization, and inequality are going to produce an unprecedented period of uncertainty for every country in the globe. Now, as academics, it raises the question, how can we help push the envelope of scholarship? How can we learn from the research that we've done in the past? And how can we deliver more actionable insights and provide real-world guidance? So that's where our research started to pick up from. We wanted to take the realization that some companies have perfected ways to manage this sort of uncertainty that constant crisis can bring. And they do so in some of the most volatile places on Earth, which are conflict zones. So to learn why some firms succeed while others fail in these areas, John and I, over the course of the last decade or so, have interviewed about 300 businesses, and we've held many discussions with leading practitioners, scholars, to learn what works under crisis and why, through a broad range of political and social conflict settings. Now, when we talked with successful firms, they kept coming back to three strategies that they employed, sometimes even by accident. They would elevate community relationships to true partnerships. They would make sure not to rely on laws alone for guidance, and they would make those principled political choices. Because for smart firms, preparing for crisis means not only calculating strategic risks and being more efficient, but also building a social license to operate. And we'll take each of these insights in turn. So for many of us, the first and most obvious insight would be that any business that makes the community a partner in their social political strategies is more likely to be successful. But in our research, we saw that companies who viewed local communities merely as sources of consumers, of staff, or even as raw materials often suffered when crisis hit. These types of companies often cut ties with their communities in the way they would do cost-saving measures, for example. But shutting out the local community also multiplied their risk of failure. Because being a partner means doing more than just philanthropy or surface-level corporate social responsibility. This is about creating a joint stake in the communities and the business's success. And successful firms realize that local context is really the key here, because what can work in one place might not work in another. It's the method of partnership is what generates this buffer of success during times of crisis. Now, our second insight is that companies must work not just with, but also beyond governments and laws, especially in places where laws or governance is weak. Now, in our research, we saw a very common mistake that a lot of businesses would make, especially ones that would go to new areas, and that's they would only partner with local officials as if they were the community themselves. When those local officials are inadequate or corrupt, that approach becomes a recipe for disaster. Now, the photo we have here is from field work that we've done in Odisha, India, on the proposed mega project by the Korean steel company POSCO. They very much did everything by the book. They did everything right, but they only followed local regulations and local rules without engaging with the community. It left a situation where they lost almost $1 billion just by misreading the local environment, and they had to sell off the project for pennies on the dollar to domestic competitors a decade later. And we've done some research on this, and I can share an article about it afterwards if anyone's interested in this case in particular. But what it shows is that working beyond the government allows businesses to not only have better community relations, but the community itself can serve as a warning beacon for crisis when the time comes. And it can mean the difference between success or failure, or even survival or bankruptcy of the company itself, as we'll return to later. Now, our third insight is perhaps the most counterintuitive, and that's that companies can succeed through crisis by making principled political choices, even when parts of the population disagree with them. And this means a company takes a clear and public stand in line with their values. That is how they can win widespread community support. And these sorts of firms are empirically shown to be more profitable in the long term. Now, the example that we can bring up here is, who we have pictured here is Hamdi Ulukaya from Chobani. He built this American yogurt company from scratch, mostly by prioritizing the disadvantaged within his community and by including progressive politics as part and parcel of his business. And he became quite successful, but when Donald Trump became president, Chobani got actually attacked for those very same things by Trump supporters. Now, many businesses in this case would maybe try to shrink away or become less political, but instead, Chobani actually doubled down on things like pro-refugee policies, and they won new customers, but because they were so clear and principled, they didn't lose that many of their existing customers. So 5 years later, Chobani is worth triple what it was when Trump was elected, and it's now one of America's most respected companies. So now, of course, these strategies overlap, and successful companies typically do all three of these, not just one of these strategies. Together, they make up what's often called a social license to operate. Now, communities give these licenses by the means of a trade. The company will provide jobs or development, they'll follow local customs, and in exchange, the company makes a profit. So this picture, for example, is from a mining district in India, where by listening to communities and supporting them as partners, companies like Tata have been able to succeed through situations of conflict and deep social insecurity. And this reflects another lesson that we kept hearing from successful companies. And they obtain a social license to operate by learning what makes the community feel secure, not just themselves. And the firms that built alliances with their community and even their competitors were more likely to emerge through crisis and more apt to grow rapidly afterwards. Now, as Laura mentioned, John and I do a lot of work in the business and peace building space. So we can place these activities and these sorts of things that companies do in a more global context. Business and peace studies really started with a question. What does ethical business look like in conflict-affected or fragile states, like the hard places in the world? And a follow-up question emerged. Could ethical businesses grow peace in those places? Now, the core of this concept is really that this growing change over the last decade or two that we all know, that the private sector should play a more constructive role in society. And I think that this quote from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres really hits it home, where he talks about companies need to be a driving force to push governments to assume social responsibilities. And if companies do their human rights and development jobs properly, they are indeed contributing for peace and human rights and social development. And you can see how this idea has taken off, not only through things like the UN Global Compact and the Business for Peace Network, but also most generally in the investment community, where some $17 trillion now has been directed to be SDG compliant, and 95% of Fortune 500 companies also support the SDGs. So now we have powerful push and pull factors for businesses to want to follow this playbook in the hard places. So now we can go to an example of where this actually worked in practice. And it's one of the places where we've done some work, which is in Colombia, because we can show here how building a social license to operate can be done. Because Colombia is a really hard place to do business. There's many different rebel groups, there's insurgencies, there's drug mafias, organized crime, paramilitaries. It's really one of the world's most complicated conflict settings. But it's also a high growth country that many people are attracted to for the opportunities it provides. Now, in our interviews with CEOs, they talk about trying to work through this very, very difficult setting. And there's a couple of ones here I feel are quite revealing. The first one was from a CEO who said that the question was clear. What do I need to do so that the rebels don't plant a bomb in my factory? Do I bring in the army or do I build 6 schools? Another CEO was more direct. He said, if you want peace, you need to sit down with those barbarians. And what's important to remember here is when he's talking about barbarians, it's not just the rebels. Like, he's also talking about government officials, he's talking about drug lords, he's talking about everyone who's involved in the conflict ecosystem. Because businesses in Colombia realize that they cannot separate themselves from these sorts of social issues. So what sorts of strategies do the successful firms do? Here's one success story that we've worked on for a couple of years, and that's a 2-year study of the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, or FNC, which is one of the world's largest coffee producers. They supply coffee for everyone from Starbucks in the US to Lavazza in Italy, even to boutiques like the Café Libre chain in Seoul. Now, the FNC is a cooperative of 500,000 farmers with a huge economic and political presence. But about a decade ago, they saw that there was a rapid rise of conflict and insecurity in their growing areas. And coupled with a crash in coffee prices, their CEO realized they needed a new approach. So they developed a program called the Footprints of Peace, which was in partnership with the Spanish Agency for International Development. It merged best practice in peace building with best practice in business to try to help farmers and their communities. Now, did it work? Not at first. The main reason it didn't was that one that many of us are familiar with, is that communities didn't trust the company to have good intentions. It took a year of dedicated presence and working through the project before farmers and other community members actually believed that the company cared as much about the community as their own bottom line. So, the big lesson is these sorts of things take a lot of time. But eventually it succeeded, and it did so in a few key ways, and I'll just mention a couple of them here. And first is that FNC realized that companies have unique abilities and skills in these areas, even more so than sometimes governments or NGOs. FNC also had a major vested interest in the community. They want to be there forever, and they want everyone to succeed. Now, the FNC as well had a history of being known in these communities, and in some places trusted even more than the local government. So they leveraged that and put their own reputation on the line, because if this didn't work out and the society went back to conflict, it wouldn't be the government that people blamed, but the company. So it's not risk-free. But development can lead to peace, especially in these sorts of community integrations. And they did this by uniting everyone who had the most to lose from conflict and insecurity, and finding ways for them to go forward together. And FNC actually built a peace in some of these local areas that was even stronger than the government's peace agreement could achieve. And the best part was their farmers received higher prices and greater yields, all while living and working in a more secure business environment. Now, of course, the FNC, though, is just one case. So we also want to take this research a little bit farther and start looking at some of the structural conditions that support or punish businesses for working in these spaces. So we launched a new project last year that really tried to understand how companies can work through crisis, and this especially in fragile urban settings of the world. And we had the fortune or misfortune of starting this project right when COVID-19 hit, so it quickly transited to a COVID-19 crisis project. But we've already started to come up with a lot of really interesting findings, and we'll just go through a couple of them here. The first of which was a large-scale survey that we did in 7 different cities of the world. Now, our first big finding was that, in every single city that we surveyed, the companies that were more responsive to community well-being were also more successful in working through crisis. Now, these sorts of efforts included hiring disadvantaged workers, assisting the unemployed, actively working to help reduce local inequality, or other concrete community building measures that didn't necessarily have any direct benefit to the company. And this kind of work appears to really pay off, because companies that did it were, between 8 and 9 times more likely to survive through the COVID-19 pandemic than those that didn't. Now, of course, it's not just about working with the community, because government roles in crises are also essential. And the amount of aid that companies got from governments also correlated to their ability to survive the pandemic. Now, through the first year of COVID in our case cities, sole proprietorships, single owners, were about 4 times more likely to close compared to businesses that had 100 or more employees. And that probably isn't very surprising to most of us, because sole proprietorships tend to be more fragile. However, those same sole proprietorships were also 4 times less likely to get aid from their governments, which correlated very strongly to the ability to succeed. So the sole proprietorships were not only more vulnerable, they were the ones who needed the aid the most and were not able to access it. So we go into detail into these findings a bit more into the Harvard Business Review piece that Laura had mentioned, which we would all be very, very happy with if you had a chance to take a look at it before it goes live. And we can talk about it a bit more in the discussion as well. So I'll end on a couple of different points here, and one of which is how we want to work on business in crisis to help take the academic discussion forward. And we see a few different ways that we can do this. And first is that we really aim to bring together the peace building and development scholars with management and business ethics in order to share research, because many of us are looking at the same issues from different viewpoints or theories or methodologies. And this is actually how John and I ended up getting together in the first place, because I was on the development studies, international relations, political science side, and John was on the law and business ethics and management side. And we are proof that this can work, even though it's something that scares a lot of people on both sides of this. But it can work, and it can deliver findings that are much more interesting than if either of us had just done it alone. And second, we really want to aim to expand theories on relationships between business and society, especially because a lot of the ones that exist right now are about extractive firms, which are very common. And third, and I think most importantly, we want to help this next generation of business contributions to society. This isn't just talking about the social license to operate or ESG, but just more conceptually and more holistically, especially now that it's being driven by a younger generation of managers who've been raised in the belief that business being a positive actor in society isn't an option, it's a prerequisite. And of course, we know that many of you as well are working on some of these issues too. So we just want to highlight a couple of forward research agendas that we think are particularly promising. First is that this field really could use more big N studies of the sorts of business and fragility projects that really marry the indicators for conflict, violence, and fragility with those of economics and business. This is really the kind of study that we really are desperately needing more of. Second, the field needs more diversity of more qualitative studies as well. because these aren't issues that just affect companies in conflict zones. But that's where scholars have tended to go to, myself and John included. But there's such a lack of studies in insecure regions that are non-conflict in East Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, and South America. There's a real opportunity there. And third, the field needs a deeper look at company policies before and after crisis, especially comparing firms that are in similar places and do different things to see if they get different results. And this relates to how we also need a better understanding of how the private sector can influence community systems to better learn what roles companies can play to help local societies. Now, Laura had promised good news, and I think I provided a little bit of good news, but we can provide a little bit more too, I hope. And that is that across all of these different settings, across all of these different socioeconomic situations, we just saw over and over again that companies that employed these lessons made more positive contributions to their communities. Now, this picture here, I really like because it's an image of a businessman in Iraq. And it shows that even in the most difficult crisis settings, the vast majority of businesses, they don't have any other choice. They have to push through. So what our main goal is to develop research that helps businessmen like this succeed ethically. Because as we all know, businesses can help or harm society through their decisions. And thankfully, we have more empirical evidence now of what works and what doesn't in these sorts of contexts. But by following these principles, we've seen businesses working through crisis in the United States, in Colombia, in Myanmar, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in India, really all over the world. They can make more resilient communities and deliver more profits in the process, if they are able to harness their unique influence as citizens. Thank you so much for listening, and I will turn the floor over now to John, I believe.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thanks, Laura, for the introduction. Thank you, Professor Kim, in a second for your comments, and a big thank you to SBS and to CASPA for arranging this and for arranging for us to speak, as Laura said, for the first time publicly about the big idea piece. What I'll do is provide sort of more of the joyful setting and then really try to wrap up. When we began this discussion, we really talked about the fact that this era of uncertainty that we're in now brings the problems that many countries have faced and many businesses have faced around the world to everyone's doorsteps. It's no longer, as it was during much of the 20th century and the beginning of this century, the case that we can think of crisis as singular, as something that happens once, as something to be dealt with and then moves on. But as Laura noted, with the combination of globalization, climate change, and inequality, one crisis is larger and then feeds into the next, which feeds into the next. Over the course of our research over the last decade, as Jason outlined, we've seen that companies in crisis zones have a particular playbook to deal with these problems. They didn't know they had this playbook. They didn't talk to each other beforehand. And so our goal is to take those lessons and share them with with everyone else in the world that now is for the first time experiencing these chains of crises and this era of uncertainty, to really help send the message that, yes, the new normal is different. And it's uncertain and it's unclear, but we are not without guidance. In the past, what was often happening is the businesses from places that were not involved in crisis were bringing their lessons to the places that were in crisis. What we're suggesting today and what our research suggests is that what we need now is the reverse. We need to take the lessons from people who have thrived, from businesses that have succeeded in some of the world's hardest places, and bring them into our own lives, into our own businesses, and into our own research. And it's there where I'll make my final point. As a business professor, I know I have, and I think all of you would agree, we have a particularly important role in playing with our students. Our students in many ways understand these issues better than we do. We often remember a time where this wasn't the era of uncertainty, and this wasn't a time of constant crisis and change. For many of our students, and increasingly for all of our students of younger generations, we see that they understand much better this concept that we are in an era of uncertainty, and they understand implicitly some of the lessons that need to be learned. It's something that we saw in our research in the 7 cities that Jason pointed out. It's something that when we looked to see the generational gaps, we saw that younger generations, the types of generations that look like our undergraduate students in business schools, that they really understand this concept and that they in fact expect to hear this sort of thing from us. It's our job then to take these lessons from the research, to build on them, to do more and better research so that we can have more refined and even more data that can empirically support the lessons that we're finding already in the field, and then to translate that into the next generation of business teaching and education. It's with that where I'll pass it over to Professor Kim, who will provide some comments and then lead the question and answer session. Thank you, everybody.
First of all, I would like to thank you to Laura, John, and Jason for their insightful presentations and thoughts. We've learned from them about a new playbook to cope with in this era of unprecedented global crisis. Well, I'm more concerned about the current situations of the world where COVID-19 has prevailed and introduced so-called the new normal economy. Uncertainty and crisis are not abnormal anymore. As both John and Jason mentioned already, this is not the only crisis as COVID-19 has evoked, but the crises are lingering to many problems which have been already existed but not been impacted so deeply until today. World is changing and turmoil, and there is no exception in Korea. As global society is more closely interconnected, sound strange, but predict the future is getting more difficult. We are living in the world of digitalization, and internet is everywhere, which means we are able to communicate in real time, anytime and anywhere. However, risks have popped up with no sense in every corner of the world. Korean marketplace also prepares this kind of future where a new paradigm should be setting. Uncertainty and crisis happen every corner of the world, and they are severely impact to the domestic market of Korea as long as Korean economy is globally connected. Today, I'm going to mention in 3 aspects: company, consumer, and government side. Companies are competing to produce competitive products and services which are very important for them to thrive in this fast-changing marketplace. Technology, marketing capabilities, new strategies to understand customers' needs and wants, preparing future, we're constantly changing, evolving new communication tools as digitalization. I think these are the topics that Korean companies have to figure out to survive and thrive in the global marketplace. And for consumers, as pandemic goes, their lifetime values are changing. Everyday life has been in different shapes to those of before COVID era. Consumers have changing their priorities that the happiness of individual or family life is getting on top. Shopping style also has moved to online and on-tech-based, which are also getting popular in global consumers as well. Traditionally, delivery businesses have been very popular in Korean market, but due to techy gadgets and mobile apps, the market size of those businesses has been remarkably growing. And this kind of business model will be continuously developing as there are more and more consumers who are used to this way of shopping habits. As the market environment is moving like this, one of the most undesired side effects is that social inequality is getting worse. For those who have more accessibility and opportunities to information and technology are getting richer, but most of others, unfortunately, are getting poorer. Especially for those who are managing traditional businesses or maintaining old business models are in great risks. These are big problems to solve for companies and individuals as well. Historically, as the market is revolutionarily changing, there used to be a huge wave of social changing. I think today is the time of era. And we all have to cooperate to generate the big and audacious ideas in business and society as well. So, what's the role of government to tackle these problems? I think that government should provide the environment of coexisting or living together and make laws to protect those in a socially weak section and guarantee the basic life managing conditions is more important. Through pandemic, the role of government is getting bigger and more powerful. Recently, Korean government has been doing its efforts to make new systems, laws, platforms to build a bridge to the next digital society. And personally, I'm very looking forward to seeing the fruits of those efforts within the near future. And at the same time, to build up the competitiveness to competing and cooperating with many other neighbor countries is the crucial factors for the future of Korea. Hopefully, more transparency in administration is highly expected. Finally, I would like to wrap up my presentation by mentioning the 5 keywords which could be characterizing Korean marketplace after pandemic. First, routinization of social distancing. Social distancing behavior is getting a basic attitude, both business and consumers. Secondly, increasing digitalization in business model. As world is moving to digitally driven society, no one is free from this mega trend. Thirdly, emerging globalization model. Globalization is a compound word of global and localization. Global, but locally conscious mind setting is needed to be in flourish into the future. Fourthly, pursuing mental well-being of people. People have setting their values based on mental happiness, not only by economic values. And last but not least, importance of social responsibility and creation of social value for better world. Community, company, and government should be a team to create the living conditions of better place to live. Well, I hope we all have to bear in mind that the lessons of this pandemic give us to make the world better place to live. Thank you. I'm going to go back to my mic to Laura.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for those excellent thoughts.
Thank you.
I have one question to kick us off, and I'm looking forward to a vibrant conversation between the three of you here today. My question begins with your comments, Professor Kim, and how you summarized the takeaways for the Korean marketplace after the pandemic. But I note that the first two, social distancing and digitalization, could run counter to the new crisis playbook's call to engage. And so, Professor Katsos, I'll ask you first, does the modern world inherently work against the playbook? And then, Professor Kim, how might Korean businesses in particular adapt these takeaways to the demands of this new era?
Thank you so much for your question, Laura. I think one of the reasons why the playbook is so necessary is because, as you noted in your question, it does go against a lot of what we're seeing on the ground. So with social distancing in particular, it's difficult to build community digitally. We're seeing this in the difficulties that tech companies are having that relate to social media. We're seeing this with governments' attempts to regulate those communities. It's very unprecedented as humans for us to be engaging or attempting to build communities in digital spaces. Though I think there's ways to do that, I also think that as humans, we are still fundamentally social and require in-person interactions. This is something that for many of us was driven home by the pandemic and by long lockdowns. What's interesting is I think lockdowns made everyone aware of this need. Before lockdowns, I think many of us would have defaulted to saying, well, digital spaces and digital communities can fully replace in-person communities and in-person spaces. I think now we all have this recognition post 18 months of on and off lockdowns that in-person interaction is really critical to our own psychological well-being, which is why I love Professor Kim's point that well-being is going to be such a key and critical component going forward. So I'd say in some ways it's counter, but in other ways, COVID has actually helped to open up a lot of people's minds to the notion that the physical face-to-face community building is really critical to businesses thriving and being able to push forward. I'll let Professor Kim talk about the Korean context, but I'll just add one more piece about the digital context. Combining these two is something that we've seen is really powerful. Right? So in the younger generation, what we're seeing is they're looking for digital spaces where they can meet digitally people who they're engaging with IRL or in real life. So that ability to combine the two is I think going to be the path forward for companies as well, where you can have face-to-face interaction, but also have more regular interaction globally so that the face-to-face interaction is something special. It's almost like a birthday party.
All right, thank you. I really understand what the digitalization and social distancing behavior. Currently, the many business models are changing to digitalization and social distancing. I think those are the businesses that most of the Korean companies are focused on right now. And especially for the generation, very young generation like Gen Z, they're really young and they're really used to using those kind of digital gadgets and communication without face-to-face. Those kind of cultural change could be one of the big wave of the market in Korea. And especially think about the Korean digitalization. The Korean market is well prepared for those kind of digitalization, and especially for young generations that really understand the benefits of digitalization. So that's why most of the Korean companies are really set up those kind of digitalization products and services to get more younger generation. I think these kind of trends could be expanded to the globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. I have to say that as an editor, being able to moderate a panel with my authors is a unique gift because I get to ask all of the questions and put you on the spot. Jason, my next question is for you, and this is not an easy question. It's how in your research did you define successful? Would you tell us a little bit about this playbook and the bottom line? Because I know that engaging deeply is difficult work. It can be very expensive work. It's time consuming. Is it profitable?
question. And yes, it's extremely difficult. And it's one where, there are so many different possible answers. But I think that that's one of the reasons why John and I have taken this long-term perspective. Because anyone can look at a point-specific time at a company going through a struggle, going through a crisis, and say, great, this company is doing an excellent job, or this company is doing a terrible job. The other issue is, it's history is often written, almost always written by the winners. So it's very easy to find companies that have managed to get through a crisis by doing some things that may or may not have been the reason why they got through crisis. So what we wanted to do was look at companies over a longer time period, just like the Juan Valdez case that I had mentioned. If you looked at that project 1 year into their attempt, it would have been considered a failure. The CEO of that company refused to accept that this was not going to work, and he actually doubled the investment, and it created something where 5 years down the line was much more successful than had they done nothing at all, or had they done a smaller project. And we've seen versions of this in many, many different places. But I'd also like to talk a little bit about a couple of things that John and Professor Kim said as well. And one is this combination of digitization and globalization, which can really gets to the core of what we talk about when we talk about community. Because I said the word community a lot in my speech, and so did John. But a community isn't necessarily synonymous with a neighborhood, as I think everyone was alluding to already. I mean, it can be a digital community. It's just, it is that community of, customers, suppliers, the people that you engage with as a business are the people that you need to recognize also have value, and you're in it together. And that's where the value really comes from. And the second is, the flip side, the negative side of that is when you combine digitization and globalization, you're left with a series of overlapping mini crises that happen almost every single day for some sorts of companies. And this is something that also we saw so much, especially with small business owners in fragile places. COVID's a great example. For many of us, COVID was life-changing. But for someone who's dealing with 5 COVID-type crises at once, it's just another crisis on their plate. So it's about a context, it's about scale of crisis, but it's also about recognizing how in the world can you as a person, can you as a company live through not just one crisis, but multiple crises that hit. And what we found is that the companies that can do that are the ones that prepare for perpetual crisis before that cycle starts.
That actually brings me very nicely to my next question. And Professor Katsos, maybe I'll begin with you, but I'd love for all 3 of you to be able to answer this. And this is about Clay Christensen's jobs to be done theory. I'm going to assume that our audience here knows what I refer to. My question is that I see echoes of jobs to be done in the New Crisis Playbook. And yet I also feel as though maybe it asks companies to expand their definition and their application of the framework. Do you see this also? How does the playbook change those responsibilities? What are the new jobs that it's asking companies to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so Christensen's notion of jobs to be done is often only construed in the context of markets and innovation. And yet, I think what we see with our playbook is companies are being asked to be members of communities, and members of communities are full citizens, which means they have this full range of responsibilities that aren't limited to just innovation or the provision of a project or the provision of a particular good or service. So what we're seeing is the companies that are thriving are the ones that are providing, are able to do the jobs that are beyond just a really narrow scope. So they're the ones that are able to provide for communities as a whole, many more goods and services, sometimes not directly, right? Sometimes it's ancillary or it's on the side or it's a complementary benefit to what is actually being sold. So we see this with delivery services quite a lot, right? So online delivery services are able to expand out really quickly and suddenly provide a whole bunch of complementary benefits to people that were unexpected. So it may have just started as something as simple as takeaway food delivery, right? So instead of going there, you get the delivery online, but then it expands out really quickly, and suddenly you have single mothers able to have baby food delivered to them. You have people who are in need who now are able to rely on the systems because they're able to do this job, but they're also able to do it in ways and provide services that these individuals couldn't get access to before. So I think that's what we're seeing. So it's more of an expansion, I think, of Professor Christensen's theory than kind of pushing it away, because I think when he conceived of it, I don't even think he expected the level of crisis and uncertainty that we've got today.
Professor Kim, I see perhaps some agreement or at least some deep thinking on your part.
Thank you. Sorry, but the time's up right now, so probably we're going to have to stop the discussion right now here, and you're going to move on the next questions on the internet or some other communication tools. Is that okay to Laura?
Yes, and I want to say a warm thank you again to you and to Jason and to John and to all of our hosts for having us here today to share these ideas.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Thank you to SBS and Kasbah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ms. Amico and professors, thank you so much for your great session. Your session gave us lots of insights to think about. Thank you again. 이번 세션에서는 코로나19로 인해 급변한 대변혁의 불확실성 시대에서 위기의 기업, 그리고 더 나아가서 환경, 커뮤니티, 정부, 아카데미아 등 다각적 이해관계자 측면에서 이슈와 역할, 그리고 앞으로 나갈 방향에 대해서 함께 고민할 수 있는 소중한 시간이었습니다. 감사합니다. 이상으로 첫 번째 세션을 마치겠습니다. 두 번째 세션은 잠시 뒤 4시부터 진행될 예정입니다. 그런데 그 프로그램 진행상 양해의 말씀 드리겠습니다. 9개의 발표자의 갑작스러운 일정 변경으로 인해서 세션 2와 세션 2세션과 3세션의 시간을 상호 변경하여 진행하게 되었습니다. 그래서 다음 세션에서는 원 프로그램의 세 번째 세션인 대변혁 시대의 공존을 위한 리더십이 먼저 진행되겠습니다. 다음 세션은 한국외국어대학교 김중화 교수님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다. 잠시 휴식 취하시고 장례 정리 후에 4시에 다음 세션에서 뵙겠습니다. 감사합니다. 이제 한국경영학회와 Sbs문화재단의 공동포럼 두 번째 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 세션의 주제는 대변혁 시대의 공존을 위한 리더십이란 주제로 한국외국어대학교 김중화 교수님, 카이스트 경영대학 진병채 교수님, 이화여대 경영대학 안지영 교수님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 교수님들 화면에서 만나보시죠.
제가 글을 제가 안 써서 다시 한번 인사드리겠습니다. 안녕하십니까? 지금 대공존의 대변혁의 시대의 공존을 위한 리더십에 대해서 우리가 이제 토론하라고 여기 모였습니다. 제가 오늘 토론에 참여해 주실 분을 다시 한번 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 제 오른편에 카이스트 경영대학의 진병채 교수님 나오셨습니다. 네, 감사합니다. 네, 제 왼편에 이화여자대학교 경영대학의 안지영 교수님 나오셨습니다. 네. 지금 대변혁인데요. 코로나19로 인해서 여러 가지 사회적인 변화와 그리고 여러 국가적인 변화 그리고 인류사회에 커다란 변화가 왔습니다. 그래서 이런 불확실성이 굉장히 많이 가시화되고 있는데 지금까지 거론되는 그런 불확실성을 일으키는 커다란 세 가지의 요인은 뭐냐면 기후변화, 그 다음에 세계화, 불평등이죠. 그런데 다행스러운 것은 우리 인류가 이제 디지털 테크놀로지를 발전시키고 또 인터넷이 많이 활용되어서 이런 여러 가지 변화들을 우리가 극복할 수 있는 그런 여러 가지 환경은 또한 조성되어 있는 것 같아요. 그런데 기업 입장에서는 이런 여러 가지 불확실성을 어떻게 하면 잘 극복할 수 있을까, 또 환경 변화에 잘 대처할 수 있을까, 그런 얘기들이 많이 있었습니다. 그래서 첫 번째 세션에서는 그 세 가지 방법, 극복하는 세 가지 방법으로 커뮤니티 관계를 진정한 파트너십으로 고양시키고, 두 번째로는 법적으로만 해결하고 정부에 의존하는 것만 아니라 기업이 원칙에 맞고 지조 있는 일관된 정치적 선택을 하라는 것입니다. 그래서 위기 극복 경영을 위해 보다 진일보된 소위 사회적 라이선스에 집중하는 것을 지금 얘기했는데요. 이러한 내용에 대해서 우리 진병채 교수님, 또 우리 안지영 교수님에게 제가 공통으로 질문을 드리겠습니다. 지금까지 토의되고 발표된 내용 중에 혹시 뭐 동의하거나 또는 동의하지 않거나 또는 새롭게 덧붙이실 말씀 있으시면 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
네. 첫 번째 세션에서 우리가 어떻게 하면 공존의 리더십을 발휘할 수 있을까, 기업의 관점에서 얘기가 있었는데, 저는 조금 다른 시각에서 한번 얘기해 보고 싶습니다. 더글라스 베커라고 로릿 에듀케이션이라는 컴퍼니를 창업 CEO입니다. CEO가 한 얘기, 로릿 에듀케이션이라는 회사가 이 전 세계의 저소득층을 대상으로 해서 이 교육의 불평등을 해소하고자 만든 베네핏 코퍼레이션인데요. 그 회사가 이제 전 세계적으로 처음으로 미국의 IPO 시장에서 IPO에 성공을 했습니다. 그 CEO에게 어떻게 하면 이 사회 문제 해결을 위해서 만들어진 조직이 이 IPO 시장에 이렇게 IPO를 성공하게 됐냐 하고 물어봤더니 더글라스 베커가 한 얘기가 돈을 잘 벌 수 있다라는 걸 보여주는 것밖에 없었다, 그런 얘기를 하더라고요. 그래서 결국은 우리가 커뮤니티가 참여하고 기업이 같이 정부도 참여하고 함으로써 뭔가 사회 문제를 공동으로 해결해 나감으로써 뭔가 건강한 자본주의로 발전하게 되는 그런 계기를 만들고자 얘기를 했지만, 좀 더 방법론적으로 좀 들어가 봤을 때 우리가 기업 차원에서 그럼 우리 사회 문제를 어떻게 해결할 거냐 하는 이런 관점을 우리가 생각해 볼 수가 있겠는데요. 결국은 우리 기업의 생리는 인풋이 들어가고 거기에 스루풋을 통해서 이제 아웃풋이 나오고, 생산된 아웃풋을 다시 재투자를 함으로써 뭔가 서스테이닝한 이런 비즈니스 모델을 만들어가는 이런 작업들을 하고 있는데, 우리가 흔히 사회 문제를 해결하겠다고 말하는 여러 가지 조직들은 인풋이 들어가서 뭔가 밸류를 크리에이션하는, 흔히 얘기하는 소셜 밸류를 크리에이션하는 이런 프로세스를 밟아가는데, 문제는 그 아웃풋이 새로운 인풋으로 들어가지가 않는다는 겁니다. 그래서 비즈니스 모델 안에서 큰 사이클이 단절이 돼 있어서, 그럼 그 인풋은 어디서 오느냐? 우리 영리 조직 같은 경우에는 우리가 벌어들인 돈이 다시 재투자가 되는데, 사회 문제를 해결하기 위한 조직들을 대부분 보면 그 인풋은 기업 외부에서 온다는 겁니다. 그래서 우리가 어떻게 하면 우리 영리 조직을 이렇게 연구하고 있는 경영대학에서 사회 문제를 비즈니스적으로 해결할 수 있는 그런 혁신적인 비즈니스 모델을 만들어 볼 수 있을까 하는 게 궁극적으로 저희에게 주어진 도전 과제인데요. 그래서 저희가 지금 고민하고 있는 거는 자본주의가 안고 있는 무수히 많은 문제점들 우리 잘 이해를 하고 있어요. 그리고 다양한 소셜 섹터나 아니면 퍼블릭 섹터에서 그 문제를 해결하기 위해서 다양한 노력들을 기울여 왔단 말이죠. 근데 여전히 많은 대안적 모델이 나오고 있다는 것은 기존 우리가 하고 있는 이 노력들이 여전히 만족스럽지 못하다는 반증이기도 합니다. 그래서 우리 자본주의 천병을 달리고 있는 우리 경영대학 안에서 우리가 그럼 어떻게 그럼 비즈니스적으로 사회 문제를 해결해 볼까 하는 그런 관점에서 소셜 벤처라는 이런 조직 혹은 사회적 기업이라는 이런 조직 그래서 혁신형 그러면서도 영리형 소셜 벤처를 어떻게 하면 만들어 볼까 하는 노력들을 많이 하고 있습니다. 그래서 그런 혁신형 소셜 벤처의 가장 궁극적인 목적은 비즈니스 모델 안에서 단절되어 있는 그 구조의 그 연결고리, 인풋은 도대체 어디서 오는가? 외부에서 오는 게 아니고 우리가 만들어낸 우리 밸류 크리에이션 프로세스 안에서 만들어낸 그 아웃풋이 다시 재투자되어서 뭔가 선순환의 구조를 갖게 되는 이런 비즈니스 모델을 한번 만들어 보는 게 결국은 우리 경영대학의 역할이 아닐까 싶은 생각이 들었습니다. 그 다음에 또 하나 관통하고 있는 게 서스테이너빌리티라는 이런 개념이 오늘 포럼의 큰 팀 중에 하나인데요. 이제 이후의 세션에서도 얘기가 되겠지만 이런 지속 가능한 이런 그린 테크놀로지라고 얘기를 하는데 그 그린 테크놀로지가 현재 정부 주도형 R&D 투자로 많이 기술 혁신이 일어나고 있다라고 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 근데 다른 한편으로 보면 왜 그린 테크놀로지가 정부 주도형 R&D로 이렇게 될 수밖에 없느냐? 당장 프라이빗 섹터에서 뭔가 태클 하기에는 수익성이 안 보인다는 거죠. 수익성이. 이걸 해서 아직 당장 돈을 벌 수 있는 가능성이 없으니까 프라이빗 섹터에서는 투자를 하지 않기 때문에 정부 주도형의 어떤 이런 R&D 투자가 되고 있는데 결국은 이게 여전히 이 서스테이너블한 기술 그리고 혁신 그리고 거기서 만들어진 기술이 이게 수익을 창출할 수 있다라는 그런 걸 보여줄 수 있어야 되는데 그게 결국은 기업의 몫이죠. 그래서 그런 부분들을 우리가 기업들이 어떻게 할 수 있을까라는 어떤 솔루션에 대해서 우리가 대의는 알고 있거든요. 우리가 이제 ESG라는 컨셉도 최근에 많이 대두가 되고 있는데 그린 테크놀로지, 그린 그로스를 해야 된다는 그 대의 명분 그리고 전략적 방향성은 이렇게 우리가 누구나 다 공감을 하지만 그러면 어떻게 그 목적을 향해서 우리가 나아갈 수 있을까라는 부분에서 솔루션에 대해서 나중에 조금 한번 추가적으로 좀 더 얘기를 해보는 시간을 좀 가지도록 하겠습니다. 네,
네.
여기까지 하겠습니다.
감사합니다. 네, 결국 큰 틀에서 보면은 이해관계자를 좀 더 생각하고 이해적 관계자를 중심으로 우리가 비즈니스 모델을 만들어야 되는데 사기업의 입장에서는 그렇게 해서 이제 이익을 내기가 쉽지 않다. 그래서 이 부분을 어떻게 우리가 해결할 것이냐 이런 말씀이신 것 같아요. 그래서 우리 그 다음에 이제 안지영 교수님 어떻게 생각하십니까?
네, 저는 학회에서 흔히 나오는 그런 코멘트를 위주로 좀 첫 번째 발표에 조금 더 집중을 해서 몇 가지 좀 여전히 남아있는 질문들이 있어서 그 질문들을 중심으로 좀 말씀을 드려보겠는데요. 일단 지금 진병채 교수님께서 말씀하셨듯이 저희가 이제 경영대학의 교수로서 특히 이제 전통적 경영학, 그 쉐어홀더리즘에 굉장히 기반해서 profit maximization, 어떻게 그러면 주주가 이런 사회적 활동을 하는 데 있어서 이제 설득을 할까, 이 인베스터들이나 쉐어홀더들에게 어떻게 이제 설득을 할까, 이런 여전히 그런 이제 질문들을 이렇게 떠나지 않았던 것 같습니다. 그런데 이제 지금은 뭐 워낙이 쉐어홀더리즘만큼이나 또 스테이크홀더리즘, 그러니까 이 커뮤니티도 그 기업의 어떤 지분을 가질 수 있는, 스테이크를 갖고 있는 어떤 대상으로서 그들과 함께 협업을 하고 또 함께 사회적인 문제를 해결해 나감으로 인해서 최근에 제가 읽은 책 중에 이제 에델만이라는 사람이 쓴 Grow the Pie라는 책이 있었는데 이렇게 지금 어떤 쉐어홀더리즘에서는 그 제로섬으로 생각하고 있는 그런 구도를 이제 전체적으로 이렇게 공존을 함으로써 파이를 크게 만들어서 우리가 그 커뮤니티와 지금 파트너십을 하는 형태를 지금 그 발표자들께서 주장을 하셨는데, 그런 그 파일을 크게 만들어서 이제 공동의 어떤 쉐어를 창출을 해내고 그 쉐어를 어떻게 이렇게 배분을 할 것이냐, 어떤 그런 문제들이 굉장히 좀 신선하고 재미있는 시각이라고 생각이 됐습니다. 그런데 이제 그 여전히 좀 어떤 실무적인 그리고 이제 좀 구체적인 그 프로세스에 관한 문제들이, 질문들이 좀 남아 있는 것 같습니다. 특히나 저는 이제 첫 번째 프린시플에서 나왔던 그 커뮤니티 파트너십이라는 아이디어가 굉장히 와닿았었고, 뭐 스테이크홀더리즘이나 ESG 경영과 굉장히 좀 밀접한 그런 어떤 현상이라고 생각을 했는데, 지금 이제 뭐 사회적 경제라든가 뭐 사회적 기업이 실제 어떤 지역 사회라든가 뭐 다양한 형태의 커뮤니티와의 어떤 협업, 뭐 그 파트너십을 많이 꾀하고 있는 어떤 상황이라고 생각을 하는데, 그런데 여전히 그럼 좀 구체적인 어떤 가이드라인을 지금 그 발표자들께서 하신 그 플레이북에서 좀 더 방대하고 좀 더 구체적인 어떤 그런 프로세스와 메커니즘을 보여주신다면, 아마 보여주셨을 것 같은데 오늘 굉장히 그 이 발표가 아주 짧은 시간에 이루어져 있기 때문에 아마도 시간적인 제약이 있으셨을 것 같아요. 그래서 어떻게 이런 파트너십, 누가 이 커뮤니티가 기업을, 혹은 기업이 어떤 특정 커뮤니티를 어떻게 초이스할 것인가, 그리고 이제 그들로 하여금 이제 그런 파트너십의 어떤 프로핏을 뭐 어떤 유인들, 그러니까 파트너십을 맺게 하는 그런 유인이 무엇일까, 그 다음에 어떤 공동의 프로핏을 만들어냈을 때 그걸 어떤 식으로 쉐어를 할 것인가, 뭐 이런 문제들이 좀 더 구체적으로 저희들이 고민을 해야 하는 것이고, 그리고 아마도 그 플레이북의 상당 부분이 어떤 구체적인 케이스로 나와 있지 않을까 저도 기대를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 이제 그 여전히 또 그 쉐어홀더리즘의 어떤 그 틀을 완전히 깨지 못해가지고, 예, 그런 측면이 있어서 진짜 이 그 특히나 크라이시스 때 이렇게 그 이 커뮤니티와의 파트너십을 했던 그런 조직들이 어떤 크라이시스의 그런 부정적인 영향에 있어서 다른 기업에 보다, 그러니까 파트너십을 맺지 않았던 그런 다른 기업에 비해서 훨씬 더 그런 서바이벌십 이 더 커지고, 그 다음에 그런 확률이 커지고, 또 이들이 그다지 그렇게 큰 영향을 받지 않았다라는 이제 그런 이제 주장과 어떤 증거를 보여주셨는데, 그러니까 이 증거를 보여주셨던 것이 그 어떤 소비자, 그러니까 커뮤니티에 있는 그 일원들과 그 다음에 이제 회사에서의, 조직에서의 어떤 그런 인식에 대한 어떤 그런 메저먼트였던 것 같더라고요. 그래서 그거보다는 오히려 실제로 그러면 정말 어떻게라는 질문이 여전히 남아있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 어떻게 크라이시스 하에서 이렇게 커뮤니티 파트너십이 어떠한 이유로, 어떤 프로세스로 뭐 예를 들어서 이제 굉장히 그 레퓨테이션이 좋거나, 혹은 뭐 이 커스터머들이 굉장히 그 회사에 대해서 그러니까 어프리시에이션을 가져가지고 더 그 회사의 어떤 물건이나 서비스를 더 잘 구매를 해서 어떤 그런 그 네거티브 샥이 좀 줄었다라고 생각을 하는지, 뭐 그런 어떤 그런 것들을 이제 좀 캡처할 수 있는 직접적인 그 측정 도구가 나와서, 예를 들어서 뭐 프로핏이라든가 뭐 세일즈라든가 이런 부분들을 좀 직접적으로 보여주면 오히려 이렇게 쉐어홀더리즘을 주장하고 여전히 그 어떤 공존에 대한 그런 가능성을 좀 의문시하는 그런 많은 독자들에게 더 좀 확신을 가져주지 않을까. 그래서 공존뿐만 아니라 중요한 것은 또 번영이기도 하기 때문에요. 모두가 다 그러니까 파이를 키워서 함께 더 큰 파이의 어떤 쉐어를 맞는 부분들에 좀 초점을 맞추면은 어떨까. 그런 부분이 좀 보강이 되면은 훨씬 더 좋은 연구고 훨씬 더 많은 오디언스들의 관심을 받을 것 같습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 결국 그 지금 현재 기업에 대해서 바라보는 관점과 기대하는 것들이 점점 더 많아지고 다양해지는 것 같습니다. 그래서 결국 방금 말씀하셨듯이 주주를 위한 기업 경영뿐만 아니라 주주를 포함하는 이해관계자들의 그런 우선순위에 대한 점검, 그리고 그것을 우리가 어떤 식으로 서로 간에 균형 있게 가져가느냐가 어떻게 보면 그 대변혁 시대의 공존을 위한 리더십의 첫걸음이 아닌가 그런 생각을 해봅니다. 그래서 제가 먼저 진병채 교수님에게 한번 다시 또 질문을 해야 되는데요. 먼저 대변혁의 변화를 어떻게 예상하시며, 그렇다면 기업 차원에서 생존과 번영을 위한 전략은 과연 무엇이 될 것인지, 또는 무엇이 되어야 하는 건지, 이것에 대해서 한번 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
네, 최근에 코로나 팬데믹 상황이 우리 뭐 경제 사회적으로 미친 영향이 상당한데요. 과거에 한 2008년에 우리가 한번 미국발 금융위기를 겪었을 때 그거를 완전하게 극복하는데 한 4년 정도 걸렸거든요. 근데 그거는 이제 미국의 어떤 국지적인 문제였는데 최근에 어떤 글로벌 위기는 이게 뭐 한 나라의 문제가 아니고 전 세계의 문제가 돼서 이게 완전히 극복하는데 한 4년이 더 걸릴 수도 있겠다, 이런 예측도 나오고 있는데, 그러면 그리고 또 정치적으로도 상당히 지금 좀 혼란스럽죠. 기존에 이제 미국하고 중국 간의 어떤 대립이라든지, 그리고 신자유주의의 어떤 종말, 뭐 이런 얘기까지 나오고 있는데, 그런 부분들이 사실상 기업의 어떤 경영 환경에 미치는 영향이 상당합니다. 그래서 뭐 신자유주의의 뭐 대표적인 뭐 키워드 중에 하나를 뽑자면 뭐 표준화가 될 텐데요. 기업 입장에서는 사실 표준화가 좋습니다. 한국에서 물건을 파는 거를 똑같이 미국에서 그대로 팔 수 있으면 원가 상승 없이 그대로 판매할 수 있으니까, 어떻게 보면 글로벌 기업 입장에서는 신자유주의의 혜택을 톡톡히 봤다고 볼 수 있겠죠. 그렇지만은 최근에 어떤 미국과 뭐 유럽 그리고 중국 간의 어떤 무역 전쟁, 그리고 관세 전쟁, 이런 것들이 아무래도 기업 입장에서 볼 때는 우호적인 환경은 아닌 것 같습니다. 그래서 거기에 따른 파급 영향으로 지금 글로벌 공급망이 하나 둘씩 이제 무너지고, 그래서 과연 이 글로벌라이제이션이 이게 끝이 나는 거냐, 막 이런 얘기까지 나오고 있습니다. 그렇지만 과거의 어떤 우리가 위기와 그리고 위기 대응의 패턴을 봤을 때 위기가 봉착하게 되면 이 자본의 이동이랄까, 그리고 상품과 서비스의 어떤 이동들은 어느 정도 타격을 받습니다. 그래서 그렇지만 그게 단기적으로 다 회복이 되고 했지만 여전히 지금 상품 서비스 이런 교육은 이런 전체 완전하게 회복은 하지 못하고 있고요. 그런데 다른 한편으로 보면 사람의 이동, 그리고 정보의 흐름 같은 거는 위기와 관계없이 계속적으로 이렇게 증가하고 있거든요. 최근에 코로나 팬데믹 이후로 이 상품 수지는 절반으로 떨어졌다가 지금 거의 한 85% 정도 회복했는데, 이 인터넷 트래픽은 과거 3년 대비 거의 2배까지 지금 증가했다고 나오고 있거든요. 그래서 글로벌라이제이션이 종말하는 게 아니고 좀 다른 패턴으로 이렇게 나오지 않을까. 그래서 이 전통적인 제조업 입장에서 볼 때는 글로벌 공급망 체계가 어느 정도 타격을 받게 되겠지만, 다른 한편으로는 소셜 미디어나 아니면 플랫폼 비즈니스나 이런 쪽 산업들은 이런 위기가 새로운 기회가 되지 않을까라는 그런 생각이 듭니다. 그리고 한국은 이제 전통적으로 이제 제조업을 통해서 이제 경제 성장을 해 왔는데요. 그래서 그럼 글로벌 공급망이 완전히 붕괴될 거냐라는 이런 부분들이 있는데, 기업 입장에서 볼 때는 우리가 글로벌 비즈니스를 할 때 크게 세 가지 리스크를 얘기를 합니다. 하나는 이제 경제적 리스크하고, 그다음에 이제 두 번째는 이제 폴리티컬 리스크, 그리고 세 번째는 이제 컬처럴 리스크, 그래서 문화적 리스크, 세 가지의 리스크를 얘기를 하고 있는데, 우리가 신자유주의 혜택을 받던 상황에서는 아무래도 경제적 리스크가 상대적으로 좀 적었죠. 적어서 우리가 글로벌 비즈니스 하기는 비교적 용이했는데 최근에 이 상황을 보면 히든 코스트가 조금 이렇게 증가하고 있습니다. 예를 들어 뭐 폴리티컬 리스크, 정치적 리스크라든지 아니면 문화적 리스크, 이게 자국 우선주의 이런 게 이제 문화적 리스크에서 이제 발생하는 리스크 중에 하나인데요. 그래서 우리가 기존에 간과했던 그런 리스크들이 늘고 있기 때문에 글로벌 밸류체인이라는 게 하루아침에 막 이렇게 바뀌지는 않습니다. 이 비즈니스라는 게 특히나 B2B 이 비즈니스는 하나의 신뢰관계 속에서 이렇게 맺어진 관계이기 때문에 꽤 장기간의 어떤 이런 이 관계를 지속하는 이런 경향이 있거든요. 그래서 당분간 이게 글로벌 밸류체인이 완전히 재편되지는 않겠지만 우리가 조금 간과했던 정치적인 리스크라든지 혹은 문화적 리스크가 점점 증가하고 있어서 이게 신자유주의 물결에서 이게 사업 전략에서 이게 흔히 유행처럼 번졌던 게 아웃소싱이었거든요. 그래서 기업이 내부에서 생산하는 게 아니고 외부에서 값싸게 생산하는 게 훨씬 더 효율적이다라고 얘기를 했는데 아무래도 이런 히든 코스트가 증가하게 되면 이 아웃소싱보다는 이제는 어느 정도 좀 내부화하는 기업 안에서 핵심적인 영업 활동은 기업 안에서 유지하려고 하는 그런 내부화 이런 전략이 조금 더 이 아웃소싱보다는 좀 더 이 좋은 전략으로 이렇게 기업 입장에서는 받아들여질 수가 있거든요. 그래서 글로벌 밸류 체인 이 재편 과정에서 이제 기업들은 아웃소싱 하는 게 우리가 더 이익이냐 아니면 내부화하는 게 더 이익이냐 뭐 이런 관점에서 좀 많은 고민을 해봐야 될 것 같습니다. 아까 이 그린 테크놀로지에 대해서 얘기를 잠시 했었는데요. 그러니까 그린 테크놀로지가 이제 정부 주도형으로 이렇게 나오고 이렇게 많은 R&D 투자가 이루어지고 있다고 얘기를 하는데 한국을 보면 전체 R&D 투자 중에 비교적 일본이나 미국에 비해서 민간의 R&D 투자 비용이 비교적 높습니다. 그래서 우리나라의 대기업이랄까 뭐 이런 중견기업에서 어마어마한 R&D 투자가 되고 있죠. 금액적으로 볼 때는 우리나라가 뭐 세계 5위 정도 R&D 투자를 하고 있지만 뭐 GDP 대비 인구 대비 비교를 해보면 한국이 글로벌 넘버 원입니다. 그만큼 R&D 투자를 많이 하고 있고 그린 테크놀로지도 현재 이제 프라이빗 섹터에서 투자를 많이 하고 있습니다. 많이 하고 있는데 지금 그린 테크놀로지에서의 어떤 한국 투자는 우리가 이제 흔히 우리가 소부장이라 얘기하죠. 소재, 부품, 장비였는데 B2B 마켓에서 투자가 많이 일어나고 있습니다. 이제 그게 한국에서 이제 이게 제한된 자원을 소규모 어떤 부품 쪽에 투자를 함으로써 뭔가 이 R&D 투자의 생산성을 좀 높일 수는 있었는데 문제는 이게 이제 글로벌 밸류 체인이 이게 무너지기 시작하면 우리가 만들었던 소재나 이 부품 장비들이 그거를 이제 OEM들이 구매를 하게 되는데 그거를 자국에서 만들려고 할 수가 있습니다. 그렇게 됐으면 우리나라 내 부품 산업이 어느 정도 그 위기를 겪을 수가 있거든요. 그래서 그런 부분에서 우리가 글로벌 밸류 체인에 우리가 안주해 있던 그런 비즈니스 모델들이 향후에 이 내부화가 이게 내부화 전략을 기존에 완성 이 제품 만드는 회사들이 내부화 전략을 추진할 때 우리가 어떻게 대응해야 될지 그에 대해서 좀 기업들이 많은 고민을 해야 되고 오늘날 뭐 많이 얘기되고 있는 뭐 전기차 쪽에 산업용 배터리가 우리 이제 LG나 삼성이나 SK에서 선제적인 투자를 해서 우리가 글로벌 탑을 달리고 있는데 결국은 그 산업용 배터리를 구매해주는 완성차 업체는 전부 다 우리나라 기업이 아니고 미국 기업이거나 지금 독일 기업이거든요. 그래서 그 회사들이 자기가 글로벌 밸류체인 조정 차원에서 내부화했을 때 우리나라 부품 회사들이 어떻게 대응해야 될지 하는 그런 부분들이 사실상 숙제로 좀 남습니다. 네. 그래서 그게 한 가지 우리나라 회사가 좀 벤치마크 할 수 있는 거는 이제 일본인데요. 이제 일본은 이 자동차 3사가 배터리 시장을 외주를 통해서 이렇게 조달하기보다는 조인트 벤처를 통해서 합작회사를 만들었습니다. 다. 세 개의 회사 전부 다 합작회사를 만들었어요. 조인트 벤처를 통해서. 그래서 핵심적인 배터리는 이게 우리가 가져가야 된다 해서 조인트 벤처를 만들었는데 우리나라 부품 회사도 아마 향후의 생존을 위해서는 그런 조인트 벤처 같은 것도 한번 고려해 봐야 될 그런 솔루션이 아닐까라고 생각을 해봤습니다. 네.
네, 감사합니다. 제가 요약을 하려고 머릿속으로 열심히 제가 팔로우하고 있었는데 중간에 좀 까먹었어요. 죄송합니다. 근데 한번 요약을 해보면 제가 틀리면 말씀해 주시고요. 지금 이런 여러 가지 불확실성이 증가하면서 결국 산업의 구조가 재편이 되고 기존 전통적인 산업이 좀 이제 손해를 보고 없어지기도 하고 또 새로운 산업이 나타날 것이다. 그렇죠? 예, 그런 얘기 말씀하셨고 그 다음에 이제 기업들이 과거에 비해서는 이제 경제적 리스크보다는 이제 정치적 그리고 문화적 리스크에 좀 더 많이 직면하게 될 것이다. 그래서 이것을 어떻게 극복할까 이런 부분에 대해서 말씀을 하셨고요. 그 다음에 기업 내부적으로는 아웃소싱보다는 내부에서 어떤 식으로 우리가 스스로 만들어서 외부 환경 변화에서 오는 그런 충격들을 좀 완화하고 글로벌 시장에서 살아남겠는가. 그래서 새로운 글로벌라이제이션이 지금 출현할 가능성도 있다. 이 정도로 요약하면 좀 되겠습니까 혹시? 네, 죄송합니다. 자, 그 다음에 우리 안지영 교수님에게 또 여쭤보겠습니다. 대변혁의 변화에 따른 전략과 리더십의 변화를 예상할 때 기업의 조직 구조, 기업 문화의 변화, 그리고 일하는 방식 등은 어떻게 변할 것인지 혹은 변해야 하는지 한번 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
네, 정말 빅 퀘스천이신데요. 예, 그 대답은 제가 여기서는 그냥 이렇게 화두로 지금의 어떤 코비드 이후의 그런 위기에서 우리가 조직과 특히 이제 저는 또 HR을 공부하는 사람으로서 이제 HR이 이제 당면하고 있는 가장 단기적인 또 그리고 이제 장기적인 챌린지를 위주로 조금 전망을 하는 걸로 하겠습니다. 우선 이 대변혁의 시대라고 하셨는데 기술은 워낙이 많이 발전이 돼 왔었는데 이게 이제 우리가 대변혁이라고 얘기를 하는 것은 이제 코비드 19 이후에 이런 기술이 사실 항상 이노베이션이라는 건 있어 왔는데 이노베이션이 언제나 어떤 산업 이노베이션이나 혹은 어떤 개별 기업의 이노베이션으로 이렇게 바로바로 트랜슬레이트 되지는 않았던 것 같아요. 근데 이 코비드 사태를 통해서 이게 정말 우리 일상 속으로 이 이노베이션이 너무 와닿게 된 것 같습니다. 저는 이제 2년 동안의 이 코비드 생활을 경험을 하면서요. 그럼 이제 이게 과연 무엇을 의미하는가? 특히나 어떤 조직에 있어서는 이제 어떤 임플리케이션이 있는가를 곰곰이 이렇게 좀 고민을 해봤는데 우선은 앞에서 진 교수님께서 잘 말씀을 해주셨듯이 어떤 생산 방식이 이제 완전히 변화가 되어서 예전에는 저희가 이제 은행 예를 들자면은 은행이 제품이 아니라 사실은 이제 서비스를 판매하고 있는 이제 조직인데 대부분 굉장히 많은 그런 돈을 지불을 하면서 지점을 통해서 그 지점에서 이제 이 은행의 직원, 그러니까 휴먼 캐피탈을 이용해서 이 서비스를 만들어냅니다. 그런데 IT 이 기술로 인해서 그리고 이제 저희가 더욱더 이제 비대면의 어떤 상황을 강요받게 됨으로 어쩔 수 없이 됨으로 인해서 이제는 모바일 뱅킹 그리고 인터넷 뱅킹 안 하시는 분이 없죠. 그러니까 은행 지점을 안 가게 됩니다. 그래서 은행 역시도 사실은 이제 내년에 최근에 제가 뉴스를 봤는데 5개 시중은행에서 내년에 이제 각 은행들의 지점을 100개 정도를 다 없애버린다고 얘기를 하더라고요. 그래서 이제 어떻게 명예퇴직을 할 것인가, 그 다음에 이제 남은 사람들을 이제 어떤 식으로 효율적으로 재배치를 해서 그런 이제 HR 시스템을 그러니까 새롭게 만들고 유지를 할 것인가, 그러니까 굉장히 큰 어떤 챌린지에 있습니다. 그래서 그런 어떤 생산 방식의 변화가 있고요. 그 다음에 우리가 지금 뭐 흔히 경험하고 있는 주요한 어떤 기술이라고 하는 것들, 뭐 아까 제가 얘기했던 인터넷 모바일 뱅킹이라든가 혹은 뭐 플랫폼이라든가, 그 다음에 이제 줌 미팅, 뭐 이런 것이 사실은 거리를, 그러니까 이 한 공간에 있지 않아도 우리가 같이 일을 할 수 있고, 그리고 공부를 할 수 있고, 그 다음에 어떤 서비스와 뭐 제품을 살 수 있고 거래를 할 수 있는, 이제 그야말로 정말 거리를 극복한 어떤 그런 의미를 갖는 것 같습니다. 그래서 사실은 이 의미가 정말 제가 생각하기에, 그리고 많은 연구자들이 어그리를 했지만 이 어떤 조직에 굉장한 큰 어떤 임팩트를 준 것 같습니다. 그래서 우선은 이제 정보라는 거에 조금 관심을 가져야 될 것 같은데요. 저희가 이제 2년 동안, 그러니까 줌으로 비대면 수업을 진행을 하면서 이 IT가 제공할 수 있는, IT로 전달하고 공유할 수 있는 인포메이션과 그렇지 않은 경우, 그러니까 저희가 이제 현장에서 실제 교실에서 수업을 하고 함께 나누는 어떤 그런 그러니까 발생하는 그런 정보의 종류가 완전히 달라졌습니다. 그래서 저는 이제 현장 강의 때는 정말 물론 뭐 정리된 그 교과서를 정리한 정말 아주 그 예쁜 서머리를 얘기를 하기도 하지만 뭔가 이렇게 굉장히 주관적인 어떤 얘기들, 아직 정보화되지 않았지만 뭔가 좀 미묘하게 정보화될 만큼의 어떤 그런 정보화가 될 수 있을 만큼의 그런 포텐셜을 가진 그런 정보들도 함께 이야기를 하고 공유를 했었거든요. 근데 저희가 2년 동안 이제 온라인 강의를 녹화를 하면서, 그리고 이제 줌 수업을 진행하면서 이런 얘기를 전혀 안 하게 됐어요. 그래서 확실히 물론 이제 거리를 완전히 극복을 하고, 그 다음에 이 어떤 생산된 정보를 굉장히 잘 정리됐고, 그 다음에 다큐멘트화 할 수 있는 그런 정보들을 빠르고 어떤 코스트가 없이 잘 전달하는 데는 이 그 비대면 테크놀로지가, 비대면 채널이 굉장한 역할을 했지만, 아까 말씀드렸던 것처럼 인간이 뭐 언제나 말로만 대화를 하는 게 아니잖아요. 어떤 굉장히 주관적인 어떤 선언이라든가 뭐 감정이라든가 미묘한 어떤, 아직은 정보화되지 않았지만 정보화가 될 수 있을 만큼의 그런 정보들이 그러니까 소통이 그러니까 공유가 안 되는 것 같습니다. 근데 사실은 기업에는 문제가 뭐냐면 이 두 가지의 정보가 다 필요하고, 오히려 그 이노베이션, 그러니까 어떤 혁신을 굉장히 추구하는 그런 기업은 오히려 후자의 정보를 더 요구를 할 수 있고, 그러니까 실제로 그런 경우가 굉장히 많았다는 것이 문제입니다. 그래서 저는 이 부분이 굉장히 HR의 챌린지라고 생각을 합니다. 어떤 식으로 앞으로도 저희가 아무리 그 거리두기, 그러니까 이전 단계로 가고 정상으로 돌아간다고 하더라도 이 정도의 어떤 비대면 원격의 커뮤니케이션 채널을 포기하지는 않을 것 같은데, 그런데 저희는 분명히 어떤 그 장단점에 대해서 아주 클리어하게 2년 동안의 경험을 통해서 알고 있고, 그렇다면 조직에서도 그런 소프트한 정보들을 여전히 우리가 유지하면서도 그 정보의 전달, 그러니까 비대면 채널을 이용해서 어떤 정보의 전달과 공유를, 그런 코스트를 확 줄일 수 있는 어떤 그런 그 믹스를 어떻게 만들 것인가. 그러니까 이 부분이 저는 굉장히 좀 고민이 될 것 같고, 그 다음에 이제 실무자분들도 많이 고민을 하실 것 같습니다. 그 다음에 이제 두 번째는 이제 이렇게 또 거리의 한계를 극복했다라는 부분들이 또 굉장히 또 좋은 점이 많습니다. 예전에는 저희가 사실 일할 때는 항상 사는 곳과 일하는 곳이 많이 분리가 되지 않았어요. 그러니까 가까운 데 살아야 저희가 일을 할 수가 있었는데, 이제 정말 그 비대면과 그다음에 이게 여러 IT 테크놀로지를 이용해서 제주도에서만 살고 싶은 사람, 그다음에 뉴욕에서 떠나기 싫은 사람, 그렇지만 굉장히 좋은 인력, 이런 사람들을 저희가 서울 본사에서 하이어할 수가 있습니다. 물론 이들과 함께 그 가상 그 팀을 이용해 가지고 어떤 식으로 이런 그 아까 얘기했던 그 다큐멘트 할 수 있는 그런 인포메이션과 그렇지 않은 인포메이션을 함께 잘 유지를 하면서 그 매니지를 할까라는 거는 또 다른 이제 챌린지로 남아 있지만 여전히 이렇게 인력의 어떤 그런 풀을 굉장히 확대했다는 차원에서는 굉장히 좋은 어떤 기회라고 생각을 합니다. 예, 그렇지만 또 굉장히 암의 사이드도 있죠. 예, 아까 제가 그 금융업 얘기를 했지만 뭐 금융업을 얘기를 하는 이유는 뭐냐면은 우리는 뭐 어떤 변화를 예측을 변화가 될 것이다라고 예측을 하지만 이미 금융업 같은 경우에는 변화가 이미 너무 많이 이루어진 상태인 것 같아요. 그래서 뭐 내년도에 그렇게 이제 5개 시중은행이 각각 100개의 어떤 지점을 없애게 됨으로 인해서 그 수많은 어떤 고용을 우리가 어쩔 수 없이 줄이게 되고 또 남은 인력들을 어떤 식으로 재배치하고 재교육해서 그러니까 효과적인 어떤 HR 시스템으로 재편을 할 것인지 이제 그런 문제들이 굉장히 단기적으로 급하게 해결돼야 되는 이제 그런 문제로 남아 있는 것 같습니다. 그 다음에 이제 마지막으로 얘기를 하고 싶은 부분이 저희가 또 하나의 어떤 가능성으로 그러니까 IT에 대한 어떤 가능성으로 HR 영역에서 이야기하는 것이 뭐 HR 텍이라고 얘기하는 뭐 HR 어널리틱스 이런 부분이 있는데요. 실제로 이제 기술로 인해 가지고 저희가 과거에는 정말 뭐 측정도 안 되고 관찰도 안 돼서 얻을 수 없는 정보들을 이제 실시간으로 정말로 많은 그런 정보들을 얻을 수 있게 됐습니다. 그런데 이제 여전히 문제는 뭐냐면 우리가 그러면 과연 어떤 정보를 이렇게 대량으로 빅데이터라는 형태로 만들 것이냐, 어떤 식으로 측정을 할 것이냐, 그리고 이걸 어디에다 사용을 할 것이냐 이런 문제가 아직까지는 어떤 산업에서 많이 그러니까 논의는 굉장히 활발하게 이루어져 있는데 그러니까 고민을 하고 있는 그런 단계인 것 같습니다. 마지막으로 이제 문화를 말씀을 주셨는데 제가 이제 문화를 전공하는 학자는 아닌데요. 그 기존에 사실은 이제 뭐 이노베이션에 가장 적합한 어떤 문화를 뭐 우리는 수평적인 문화라고 얘기를 합니다. 그러니까 되게 그 의사소통에 어떤 위계가 없고 활발하게 어떤 자율권을 많이 주고 책임도 주고 어떤 위계를 전혀 주지 않는 이제 그런 문화라고 이야기를 하는데 그런데 이제 이런 그 비대면과 뭐 코비드 이후의 그런 조직의 문화가 좀 우리가 알고 있는 수평적 문화하고는 조금 다를 수도 있을 것 같아요. 그러니까 기존의 그런 수평적 문화는 사실은 공간을 함께 함으로써 더 큰 시너지 효과가 있었던 것 같습니다. 이거는 그냥 저의 추측인데요. 뭐 구글이라든가 여러분들 뭐 그 MS가 늘 자랑하고 있는 그 캠퍼스라고 얘기하는 회사 구조를 보면은 뭐 완전히 벽 다 허물고 다 같이 놀고 뭐 먹고 이렇게 해서 같이 부대끼면서 같은 공간에서 수평적인 그런 구조를 만들면서 굉장히 많은 시너지를 일으켰는데 이게 지금 우리가 거리가 멀어짐에 따라서 되지 않잖아요. 그래서 약간은 그런 다른 형태의 그런 제3의 어떤 문화의 형식이 나오지 않을까 이렇게 기대를 하고 있습니다.
예, 감사합니다. 제가 요약을 하려고 그랬는데 시간이 많이 지나돼 가지고 요약은 생략하고요. 오늘 토론회 결론 한번 요약해 보겠습니다. 우리가 그동안 좋은 리더십이라고 여겼던 것은 사실 과거 앞으로 새로운 그런 대변혁의 시대에 별반 다르지 않다고 생각합니다. 시대와 환경을 초월해서 좋고 필요한 리더십의 특성은 일관된 것으로 생각이 되고요. 다만 기업과 기업 구성원, 기업이 활동하는 물질 환경과 인간 사회, 그리고 특히 주주를 포함하는 이해관계자에 대한 관점과 우선순위의 점검, 그리고 이에 따른 변화가 필요하다는 것입니다. 대변혁의 시대에 지속 가능한 생존과 번영을 위해서는 첫째, 지향하는 가치를 분명히 하고 둘째, 기업이 속한 사회에 좀 더 적극적인 참여를 하며 그리고 자신만의 독특한 가치를 만들므로 기여해야 한다는 것입니다. 오늘 두 분 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다. 이것으로 마치겠습니다.
감사합니다. 세 분 교수님. 이번 세션에서는 대변혁 시대 공존을 위해서 그리고 더 나아가서 파이를 키워 번영을 위해서 나아갈 기업과 사회의 방향에 대해서 다양한 이슈, 특히 기술적이고 조직적인 여러 가지 현황과 과제들을 배울 수 있었습니다. 지금 오늘 제안해 주신 도전 과제들이 앞으로 이제 구체적인 실무적인 프로세스나 메커니즘으로 실현될 수 있을 것으로 기대합니다. 네, 그럼 이제 잠시 휴식을 취하시고 4시 50분부터 오늘의 마지막 세션이 진행되겠습니다. 다음 세션은 Future of Capitalism이라는 주제로 자본주의의 미래에 대한 이야기로 구성했고 연세대학교 이두원 학장님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다. 이제 잠시 휴식 취하시고 4시 50분에 뵙겠습니다. 온 오프라인으로 참석하시는 참가자분들 모두 마지막까지 함께 해주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다. 이제 한국경영학회 Sbs문화재단의 공동포럼의 마지막 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 이번 세션의 주제는 Future of Capitalism으로 자본주의의 미래에 대한 논의로 구성되어 있습니다. 연세대학교 경영대학 이두원 학장님과 영국 유니버시티 칼리지 런던 마리아나 마추카토 교수님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 교수님들을 화면으로 만나시겠습니다.
Hello, everybody. My name is Duwon Lee, Professor of Economics at Yonsei University and Dean at College of Commerce and Economics at Yonsei University. Professor Matsukato, it's really nice to see you. Would you please introduce yourself
Thank you. It's wonderful
for the
to see you.
audience?
Sure. I am Mariana Matsukato. I am the professor of innovation and economic value at University College London, where I founded and direct the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose.
Great. As you know, this forum is co-sponsored by Korea Academic Society of Business Administration and SBS Foundation. And the theme of this session is the future of capitalism. As far as I know, Professor Matsukato has proposed many fresh ideas about the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. And I believe that she must be the best person to deliver a presentation on this issue. Professor Matsukato, you have 20 minutes for your presentation, and then it will be followed by Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm really thrilled and honored to be here at the SBSD Forum. So what I'd like to speak about are really the key lessons from my recent book called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. Next slide, please. So the current moment that we're facing is one of an extreme wake-up call globally. We found ourselves completely unprepared to deal with a health pandemic. We did not manage globally to provide personal protection equipment to our frontline workers. We did not manage to reduce the digital divide so that children at home could continue to access their human right to education. And really crucially, we are not managing to vaccinate the entire world. In fact, we have what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, calls vaccine apartheid, where most of the vaccines are actually being hoarded by a very small group of countries. Next slide. And of course, we also know that this health pandemic has been on the back of another terrible crisis, which COP26 has been debating the last couple of weeks, which is the climate crisis. And here too, we're simply not moving at pace. We had a 16-year-old, Greta Thunberg, tell us 2 years ago, if your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate? Should I stay? Should I go? No, you get out quickly. And we're not moving at pace. And the IPCC report told us this summer that if we don't start moving much more at pace, urgently, getting out of a burning home, the climate change we are facing right now will become irreversible. Next slide. And we also know that global companies have, really in some ways been in trouble, and they're talking about how to change, but we're not really seeing the walk yet. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the walk towards a different model of corporate governance. We have a lot of extraction happening globally, where something like $4 trillion has been used just to buy back one's own shares. amongst the global 500 corporations globally. And this is why there's a lot of talk about bringing purpose and stakeholder value to the center of corporate governance instead of just maximizing shareholder value. But unfortunately, this isn't really changing. In fact, one of the reasons that we're not vaccinating the globe properly is that a lot of even large pharmaceutical companies continue to prioritize short-term profits and use intellectual property rights, so patents, as a way to extract rents. And this is not the moment, of course, to be doing this, given that what we really need with COVID-19 is collective intelligence and sharing of knowledge. Next slide. We also have, and this is what I've been talking about for years, a huge problem within our government institutions. In order to transform our growth model to be more inclusive and to be more sustainable, we can't just keep patching up the system with bandages. So either we have kind of a regressive attitude towards governments, you know, the kind of Reaganite attitude, get out of the way. But the real problem is that at best, on the other side, we talk about the role of government as fixing market failures, putting patches on the system, investing in the gaps that are left by the private sector, research and development, or putting patches on climate change, maybe with a carbon tax. And these, of course, are needed, these patches, but they can't be done through patches. They need to be done through a market shaping, a market creating framework, not a market fixing one. Because if you're always fixing a system, you will, of course, always be too little, too late. Next slide. So really what the book talks about is how can we apply this ambitious, dynamic approach to organizational structure, to public-private partnerships that have real incentives for innovation and quality improvement, but all focused towards a goal, a common goal. And really the goals today have to be the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which every country, Korea, the United States, Italy, where I'm from, Brazil, every country has signed up to them. But we're not moving at pace on any of them. These are 17 broad goals, which I call challenges, which must each be turned into different types of moonshots, different types of missions. And to do this, I've been advocating with different governments that they actually implement a mission-oriented approach. So next slide, this is an example of how I made the case to the European Commission to begin with their challenge approach of inclusive and sustainable growth, but turn that into a targeted, ambitious mission that can actually be answered, yes or no, did we get there? And to foster as much intersectoral collaboration as possible. This is required so that we take missions outside of departmental silos. And then to really structure the tools on the ground, grants, loans, procurement, to foster as much bottom-up experimentation. Next slide, please. So here you see an example of two missions, one around carbon neutral cities, and another one around getting 90% of the plastic out of the ocean. And for each one of those, so many different sectors are required, whether it's real estate, construction materials, transport, software, and so on. Next slide. But what missions have to do is they must inspire. They must be bold and inspirational. They must have a clear direction. They must be ambitious while realistic. They must foster that cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary interaction. I repeat interdisciplinary because as an academic, it's not just about STEM subjects. We also need poets and the humanities to help us think about how we want to live in the future. And they especially need to be designed to drive multiple bottom-up solutions. The one-way, linear, top-down system kills innovation. We know that. And it's not about the state doing everything, but it's the state putting a direction on change and then fostering that bottom-up solutions. But this really means tilting the playing field, making sure that we have all the different policies and activities aligned in that direction. Next slide. And the European Commission has, on the back of my work, chosen 5 EU mission areas. We have the Horizon program now, which is 100 billion euros, which has a chunk of it dedicated to these missions. But of course, the real goal is to foster as much different investments amongst the private sector and public sector as possible. So providing that mission-oriented leadership can then crowd in other forms of finance. Next slide. So one of the things I've also been doing is convincing or helping governments transform their industrial strategies away from being a list of sectors to protect, instead of choosing sectors, which will always be a random list of sectors, choosing the problems that are being faced. So the UK government, with my work, decided on these 4 bold problems, challenges: clean growth, future of mobility, aging society, and the data economy. Next slide. And then transforming each one of those challenges into missions like the future of mobility one, which advocated for having a system of transport which was both congestion-free, but also 100% accessible by all people, including those with disabilities. So some of those bottom-up projects, of course, had to address the world of disabilities. Next slide. This also means that we need to transform our financial institutions like public wealth funds or public banks away from just giving subsidies, grants, and loans for companies to stay in place, but really be transformational. So I helped set up a new public bank in Scotland, which is a mission-oriented public bank, providing that patient long-term finance to those companies that are willing, I repeat, willing, because we must pick the willing, not pick the winners, willing to move with Scotland around its ambitious agendas, for example, digitalizing the National Health Service. Next slide. And I think all these lessons that I'm talking about are really key if we want to walk the talk of stakeholder value. As I mentioned, in places like the World Economic Forum, we talk about purpose, we talk about stakeholder value, but if we can't do it with the vaccine, well, when are we going to do it? But we must do it with our digital platforms, with health innovation, and of course with the sustainable growth path of clean technology. It's not enough to just invest in an area if we don't govern the process towards the common good. Next slide. And this is why people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman in the United States, but many others, including myself, have been advocating, if we care about health for all, what does that actually mean for how we price drugs, for how we construct public-private partnerships, for how we stop allowing patents to lead to the kind of rent extraction I talked about before. Patents are fine, but they must be narrow, they must be weak, so hard to license, easy to license, and they must be downstream, not upstream. If we have patents that are too upstream in the production process, that means that we are actually privatizing the research itself, which then hurts that kind of knowledge sharing that we require, and especially for developing countries, the needed imitation in that first stage to even learn how to produce and innovate in a particular area. Next slide. And I think also one of the interesting lessons from COVID-19 is that we're putting huge amounts of money into the system last minute because of the health pandemic. Well, we should be careful. Next time, let's make sure that we are actually investing in the needed resources like health systems in a more continuous, normal way, not just on the back of a pandemic where, again, it's too little too late. But also, there's an opportunity right now to really build back better, or build forwards better, an expression I prefer, by putting in conditionalities that are linked to the public funds that are helping certain types of companies in the aerospace industry and the tourism industry and all sorts of sectors that are really feeling the weight of a pandemic where we've been in lockdown for a long part of the last 2 years. And you see here the face of the French finance minister, because he actually put some strong conditions attached to the bailouts that were received by Renault, the car manufacturer, Air France. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions in the next 5 years in order to access that bailout. Similarly in Scotland, but also in Austria and Denmark, they put conditions that those countries that have become accustomed to using tax havens will not be able to access the recovery funds. And it shouldn't be seen as a stick. It should really be seen as a carrot. How do we make sure that instead of just flooding the system with liquidity, as we did after the financial crisis, or just giving out subsidies and guarantees, we actually work to construct the kind of public-private partnerships that got us to the moon, that argue no excess profits and how to use price schemes to move towards a direction of change, tilting the playing field, picking the willing, shaping markets, not just fixing them. Next slide. So I'm now done with my presentation, and really what I hope is that this idea of missions and moonshots allows us to really do capitalism differently, because the economy and markets are outcomes. There's no economic pressure being faced by anyone. The economy is an outcome of decisions that we make within private institutions, within public institutions, and especially how they relate one to another. So I really advocate for walking the talk of stakeholder value, but also within governments to transform the current remit, which is simply to fix markets. I believe we need to shape and co-create the markets of the future in order to tackle the challenges that we have. And again, we've all signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the challenges. This is the moment to turn them into moonshots. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Professor Mazzucato. It was really inspiring and stimulating presentations. Let me have the privilege of being a chairman and ask you a couple of questions first. And if there is any other question in the audience, I will probably deliver it to you, if the time is allowed. Well, first of all, would you elaborate on the difference between your industrial strategy and the conventional industrial policy? I understand that your industrial strategy is more mission-oriented, when the conventional industrial policy is more industry-oriented. But I presume that there got to be more differences between those two.
Yes. So the history of industrial policy has been that there's both horizontal policies that are about investing in the needed structures like education, research and development, institutions like science industry linkages, and then vertical areas which are prioritizing particular technologies, sectors, and so on. So what the mission-oriented approach does is the vertical bit has to be transformed away from choosing random sectors or technologies or even types of firms. You'll know there's a lot of attention in industrial policy on small, medium enterprises, which again, I think is a bit random. You know, why is size important? Why is a particular sector more important than another? Why are we obsessing about technology when we know that technology is often an outcome of trying to solve problems? Like everything in our iPhones was actually funded by different public agencies that were trying to solve problems, right? The internet was the solution to DARPA's challenge, which was to get the satellites to communicate. GPS, you know, in our phones as well, was the solution to the Navy's problem of knowing where the ships were. So really the lesson for me is that the vertical elements, the horizontal elements remain very important. Of course, we need proper national institutions for basic research, science industry linkages, a properly funded education system at all levels from the age of 0 basically until 18. But the vertical need to transform to be challenge and mission oriented. So instead of obsessing about technology sectors or firm size, we focus on the problems and then ask what is the capacity and the transformation that's required within all of our sectors. Let me give you an example. In Germany, where they've had the Energiewende mission, that meant that the public bank they have, the KfW, did something quite extraordinary, which was to put a condition on the steel sector to lower its material content in order to access the loan. That way, that support to the steel sector was not just supporting it because steel is important to their industrial strategy, it was supporting it because steel had to transform towards the strategy of the Energiewende to lower carbon emissions in the country. So it's actually quite radical because it changes the approach from subsidies and guarantees given so sectors can stay in place, particular sectors, which are strategic sectors, towards a conditionality given to as many as sectors that are willing, again, picking the willing, not picking the winners, which is the old way, that are willing to transform themselves, whether it's digital, nutrition, construction materials, steel, and so on, towards national objectives. And so where we need to prioritize are in the challenges, not on the types of sectors that are being supported, but no sector should be getting support unless, you know, there's concrete willingness to transform and innovate towards goals.
I see. Well, you mentioned about those missions, and so far as I know, many of those missions that you mentioned requires huge amount of money. as you mentioned about the Apollo project, I suppose that it costed more than 1% of the USA total GDP to carry out that mission, right? But, having said that, as you know, most of the OECD countries these days, they do have fairly fragile fiscal conditions. And I wonder how we can mobilize all those financial resources that would be necessary to achieve those missions. Can you elaborate on this?
I think I think there's 2 points. One is many of those fiscal constraints you mentioned are false. They're self-imposed. It's like self-flagellation. So, when we go to war, when countries go to war in the OECD, has anyone ever said, oh, sorry, we can't go, there's no money? Money is created when they go to war. So the problem is we have not treated our social problems with the same urgency that we feel when there's, war, which is then presented as a security risk. So money literally comes out of thin air, as it did with COVID-19, where due to the recovery that was needed because otherwise the globe would have sunk into a serious depression, money came out of thin air. Look at the amounts of money in the United States today. Now, of course, the fiscal space that advanced Western countries have that have their sovereign currency is different from those, say, that are in the developing world or those that don't have their sovereign currency, even in developed parts of the economy. So the first is making sure that we're not creating false fiscal constraints. But the second is exactly what you said, that because budgets maybe are limited, we don't have an infinite budget, that is why you need a mission-oriented approach. Because what missions do is they catalyze, they inspire, they crowd in, they create additionality. What is additionality? It means a policy design that catalyzes investment to happen in other parts of the economy that would otherwise not have happened. What we often have in non-mission oriented programs are subsidies and guarantees where government is either just replacing investment that should happen in the private sector but doesn't, either due to inertia or financialization, but also that doesn't inspire because it doesn't set a direction. So by not inspiring, it doesn't increase the expectations in the business community of where future opportunities lie. And that's in fact a key driver of investment, the increase in expectations of opportunity space. So missions designed to increase the perception of the opportunity space to crowd in business investment and other forms of finance will increase the multiplier. So even with the modest, or if you want, not infinite public budget, the total multiplier effect is much greater.
Great, thank you. It really helped me to understand your ideas, especially the part you emphasized, the multiplier effect. Thank you. Well, one more question. You emphasize the need to collaborate between the public sector and the private sector in terms of this shaping the market, sharing the risk and sharing the reward. I understand the concept, but I think the most difficult part would be to share the reward. Setting up the collaboration would be relatively easy in the beginning, and probably it'd be okay to share the risk. But how about the reward? How can we, share the reward between public and the private sector?
So this is my favorite question because, to be honest, I get bored when people say, oh, I agree with you, great, great. And many people don't agree with me when I talk about sharing rewards. They get nervous. They say, oh, that's socialism. So let me give you an example, and then I'll backtrack and give you the bigger point. After the financial crisis, the United States had a very large stimulus program, $800 billion. And many people complained, by the way, that they didn't share the rewards. They, bailed out Goldman Sachs basically for $10 billion. And then when things went well, Goldman Sachs kind of keeps the rewards. When things go bad, government bails them out. What happened after the financial crisis is they put in $800 billion, and they decided early on, Obama's administration, to direct it in a green direction. So part of that was also used by the Department of Energy to provide guaranteed loans to companies like Solyndra, which received $500 million in a guaranteed loan, and Tesla Motors, which of course everyone knows, Elon Musk's company, which received about $470 million. What later happened was Solyndra went bust, and the taxpayer bailed them out. Tesla did very well, and it's because Elon Musk is a genius, right? No one knows about the public loan. Now, what Obama did, the administration, was the opposite of what I advocate for. They said to Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. Now, that makes no sense, because if a company doesn't pay back the loan, it's probably not a very good company. Why would you want 3 million shares in it? They did pay back the loan in 2013. In the meantime, the price per share went from 9 to 90. So that difference, 9 to 90, multiplied by 3 million, would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. So that would be an example of equity stakes where you're sharing not just the risks, but the rewards. Instead of getting the rewards from a failing company, so you just get bad debt into your company, what does it mean to actually make sure that you're getting some of the upside? And that requires thinking, not like a communist, but like a public venture capitalist. You know, Yozma in Israel, for example, is a public venture capital fund, without which there would be no startup nation. So these are potentially temporary equity stakes. Other mechanisms of sharing rewards could be retaining a golden share of the intellectual property rights. Another method could be having a public wealth fund, which many companies, including Google, whose algorithm was funded from the public sector, as well as the internet, of course, that Google uses, to pay into some sort of common fund in recognition of the huge benefits that they are receiving from these public investments. But another way, lastly, is by putting these strong conditionalities, because it doesn't just have to be a monetary reward. It could be a reward in terms of making sure that company profits are reinvested back into the economy. That, by the way, is where we got Bell Labs. Bell Labs came from a period in US history where the state was much more bold and put conditions attached to AT&T that to retain the monopoly status, AT&T had to reinvest profits into the real economy, innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. Bell Labs was the answer. So especially in a period where we have global hoarding of profits and financialized profits going to share buybacks, things like conditionalities for reinvestment, sometimes also with the direction of that investment, as I talked about, towards reduction of carbon emissions, itself is a way to share the rewards, because it creates a deal. And when we say the word Green Deal, as Greta says, with the green, listen to the science, but the deal requires a new social contract. So the sharing of the rewards requires real creativity on new types of social contracts.
Great. I'm so relieved that you talk like a public venture capitalist, not like a socialist. Good to hear that. I suppose that this would be my last question. I understand the idea of shaping the market by the public sector, by the partnership of the public and private sectors. But what if you shape the market in the wrong direction? We used to make these kinds of mistakes in the industrial policy era, right? What is your measure to prevent shaping the market in the wrong directions?
It's a fantastic question. And if we don't ask questions like that, we are just implementing a new ideology, right? One ideology replaces another ideology, which is not the way to have change. So the first is to recognize mistakes will be made. Coming back to the public venture capitalist view, you need a portfolio. We cannot be putting all our eggs in one basket. That's the point of the mission-oriented approach, not to choose one sector and put all your money on a couple sectors, but choose problems and get lots of different sectors to transform. So I think the risk of putting all your eggs in one basket in one part of the economy, then failing so the whole thing falls apart, is lower through a mission-oriented approach, because it requires that cross-sectoral transformation. That's different from a mission that is all just about one thing, which if that one thing goes wrong, the whole thing kind of falls apart. That's the first thing. The second is to learn from the mistakes. I've been advocating for a long time that the state is no longer agile and flexible because we see it at best as a market fixer. It hasn't even been investing within its own capabilities, as my presentation talked about. So it does get captured by brochuremanship or by industrial interest, lobbying, nepotism, corruption. So by actually focusing on big problems and making sure that it also invests within its own capabilities to be agile, flexible, but to redesign procurement, to galvanize, again, cross-sectoral investment. I think it both limits capture, because your focus is on the problems, but also justifies investments within what I call the dynamic capabilities of the public sector. And when we talk about learning within institutions, learning is learning by doing. So you also have to invest in those processes that allow you to recognize mistakes and learn from those mistakes, as I mentioned NASA did on the back of the Apollo fire. And that requires also a dialogue about, that it's okay to make mistakes. Unfortunately, when civil servants make mistakes, they're often on the front page of the newspaper. Whereas a venture capitalist, when he or she makes a mistake, they brag about it. Kleiner Perkins, big success with Genentech. Before that, they had 7 or 10 failures. We know that's required in order to succeed. We need a bit of more of a dialogue with our citizens that in order to be goal-oriented, we will have to accept some mistakes, but also the pressure by citizens should be to make sure government is learning from the mistakes, and also that the kind of summation of the parts is moving the economy in a better way. But also one of the key points about missions is to get that organizational culture that knows how to pivot. One of the reasons DARPA, which again invented the internet, is so successful is they also know when to turn the tap off, not just turn the tap on of funding. And they have very dynamic metrics for which allow them to be both long-termist, but also in the meantime, know when to pivot, when to change. So agile, flexible, instead of siloed, rigid, vertical government structures are key. And this is why I've set up in London a whole institute, a department at University College London, trying to train global bureaucrats how to think in this way to produce creative bureaucracies, not the wrong bureaucracies.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'm pretty sure that you must have tons of more about, but I suppose that we can read your book, The Mission Economy. It was truly an inspiring and very interesting discussion with renowned Professor Mariana Mazzucato. I think I have to wrap up this session. Once again, I thank you for this opportunity provided by Korean Academic Society of Business Administration and SBS Foundation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Dean Lee and Professor Mazzucato, thank you very much for your great session. 감사합니다, 이 학장님. 두 교수님의 자본주의의 미래에 대해 열띤 토론을 들을 수 있는 시간이었습니다. 자본주의 미래를 위한 다양한 미션들, 또 미션 실행을 위해서 준비해야 될 다각적인 재정, 기업의 파트너십, 아니면 공공민간 협력 체계 등 우리가 많은 것을 배울 수 있었습니다. 이상으로 준비된 한국경영학회 Sbs문화재단의 공동 포럼의 세 세션을 모두 마쳤습니다. 마지막까지 포럼에 함께해 주신 온 오프라인 참석자 여러분께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 올립니다. 코로나19 팬데믹 상황이 장기화되는 지금 이번 포럼에서 진행한 뉴노멀 시대의 대변혁과 공존의 리더십 주제 발표와 토의를 통해서 우리가 공존하기 위한 지혜와 길을 찾아보는 시간이 되셨을 것으로 기대합니다. 그럼 이것으로 한국경영학회 Sbs문화재단의 공동포럼을 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 코로나로부터 모두 안전하시고 건강하시길 기원합니다. 감사합니다.